Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Hi, everybody. I thought this week I'd continue my Afghanistan series about my time as commander at Kandahar Airfield in 2008. And this week I would talk about one of the things that occupied an enormous amount of my time, to some extent self-inflicted, but nonetheless very important, and that is visits. So I titled this episode Visits, and More Visits, because they were something that was a hugely, hugely frequent feature. You can imagine with a base that's so big, with around 25,000 people by the time I was leaving, and about 20 nations, and all of the attention that then brings for the fact that it's a war zone, it's a conflict, it's very media worthy. There's all sorts of reasons for people to visit. So the amount of visits I had, senior visits, I mean, there are obviously an enormous amount of low-level visits that never touched me at all, but senior visits who were coming in to visit their people and talk to their people and understand what was going on. Some of those visits were directly to us and to the leadership establishment of the base to actually look at what was going on from a NATO point of view. A lot of them, though, were national visits. They were looking at the national contingents. So they weren't specifically for me, but my view that I set out very early on and talked to the national contingent commanders on the base about was that any senior visit coming in, I should at the very least greet them on arrival and just say welcome to the base, because I was responsible for the air environment and the logistics and the force protection. So those were pretty key things for any visitor. Given that they were almost certainly going to need force protection, they were going to be flying in without exception, and they were going to be probably at least eating during the time they were there. So I wanted to make sure I had the chance to basically showcase a little bit of what we were doing from a NATO point of view, running the base in a very brief brush by, as the Americans would say quite often, on arrival. And that would be it. That would be all I would do. Some of the visits I got a lot more involved in, obviously, and I was there for a substantial part of it. But very often it would just be literally a meet and greet. And I look back in thinking about doing this episode, I look back through my photo collection, and I've got, thanks to the wonders of digital photography these days, I have nearly 4,000 photographs from my time in Afghanistan, some taken by other people, a lot taken by me. And they provide a great record of what went on over that time. And very often, obviously, with visits, there would be some pictures of that kind of grip and grin, meet and greet piece at the very beginning. And I thought it was worth just a discussion, not just about the visitors themselves, but I will cover some of that, but also just the kind of different perspectives you get when you meet different types of visitors and the impressions that you get. And the age-old saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, is really true. And I think that was true for me on the visitor, but it was also true for the visitors on me. And one or two of the visits that I'll touch on were particularly striking in that regard. So who did we have over the time I was there? If I look back, we had a mix of political visitors, senior military visitors, so often chiefs of defense for their own national contingent or close to the top of the defense establishment. A lot of journalists over time, a lot of contractors and people who were supporting their contract teams, because a lot of the logistics side of life was provided by contract support. So there were a whole range of people who were often very senior in their own organizations and were important pieces of the puzzle for what was going on in Afghanistan. Obviously, I was particularly interested in the British visitors, being a British guy and a senior Brit running the whole base. But I had a separate British contingent who were not under my direct command, who were on the base. And there were nearly 2,000 British troops and airmen on the base. So it was a chunk of what we had. We had a huge amount of Americans. We had a huge amount of Canadians and a lot of other smaller contingents, including Dutch, Germans, Australians, just to name but three. And obviously the Afghans who were there locally as well. And I haven't really included them in the visit because it was their country. When I look at the political visits, it was really striking for a few reasons. We had visits, if I look at just UK politicians to start with, we had the leader of the opposition, David Cameron at the time. We had William Hague came along with him, who was at that stage Shadow Foreign Secretary. We had the actual Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, came with Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State in the United States. That was a big deal. I mean, she was a really, really obviously big player. And I'll come back to that one. We had Nick Clegg, who was leader of the Liberal Democrats, and a raft of other politicians from other countries. What was really striking for me, speaking as a Brit now, obviously on this, was that the UK Prime Minister was Gordon Brown at the time. He came to Afghanistan 3 times during my time there and never once came to Kandahar Airfield. He went to Helmand Province and he flew directly into Camp Bastion, which was obviously in Helmand Province, to visit the troops there. And okay, Helmand was the center of gravity for the UK in Afghanistan. It was the province that we were fighting very hard in and having some really tough times. But as I say, we had 2,000 Brits at Kandahar Airfield. And the fact that Gordon Brown didn't feel it was appropriate to come and visit us, or for whatever reason didn't do it, I find incredibly disappointing. And that, without him even turning up on the base, gave me an impression I didn't like, because I thought that was just poor and sent the wrong message to all of the British forces that we had there, doing a very, very demanding job in tough conditions. The opposition visits were interesting. They were really, really engaging and really interested. And I've got some pictures of standing on the top of the headquarters building that we had, which we call the TLS, the Taliban Last Stand, which had a missile hole in the roof from where it had actually been bombed by the Americans before we'd actually occupied the airfield and taken it back from the Taliban. And we used to use that as a sort of semi-hardened facility that was a useful structure for us to work out of as a headquarters. And it also provided a great viewpoint across the whole of the kind of real estate. And I've got some pictures standing up there with Nick Clegg, latterly of Meta, Facebook, which is where he works now. But we had an amazing conversation over quite a lengthy period of time. And he was genuinely really, really fascinated by what we were doing, where the direction of travel was, and how we were approaching the task. And the same was true when we had David Cameron. The same was true when we had David Miliband, Condoleezza Rice, etc. They were all really, really engaged, interesting people. And I think often politicians get a bit of a bad rap. You know, they get very harsh exposure in the media, I guess. And it's when you get up close with them and you have a chance to talk to them and work with them quite closely on these sorts of things, out of the view of the cameras and off the microphone, so there's no media involvement, etc. You get a much more direct, personal, unvarnished approach, I think. And they are genuinely great human beings who are doing a fantastic job. And that was true with all of those ones that I've mentioned. I think they were really, really impressive people. And it was lovely to have a chance to talk to them over some time. The military visits were interesting as well, because obviously they all understood what we were doing. They were very focused on what we were doing. I had everyone from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, Admiral Mike Mullen, through to the Dutch Chief of Defence Staff, General Van Oom, through our own senior military as well, where we had a range of senior British military visitors who came out, and some of those were actually looking directly at what we did at Kandahar. And again, it was always really valuable to spend time with them and have a chance to share what we were doing, where our challenges were, where we needed a bit of help, where we were actually thought we were doing really, really well, where we could big up some of the people and the personal individual performances, where we would get them to do stuff that was very memorable to the people on the base. So where there was an opportunity to turn around and get some of these senior individuals to meet soldiers and airmen on the base, to present them, for example, with medals, or to just shake their hand and have dinner with them in the dining facility. Those were valuable opportunities that made an incredible impression on the individuals that they met. And so it was really important that we found the time to do that. And the leaders were great at doing that. Invariably, they were really, really useful and keen to get involved doing that kind of thing. So that was terrific. Some of them were tinged with tragedy. General Van Oom from the Netherlands had lost his son in Afghanistan only a very short period of time before he actually came out to visit us. And I really felt for him. My heart went out to him. He came out a couple of times while I was there. And I know that it must have been incredibly difficult for him in that role as running the Dutch military to then be facing such personal tragedy, obviously for his family. And I can remember the conversation with him where, he was clearly having to reassure his wife that he would be okay and so on, because she was clearly terribly worried that he was now visiting Afghanistan with very good reason, that she lost her son out there. And those kind of conversations, again, put a real human face on people who you often would not necessarily think of in that sense, because you look at them from a leadership point of view. You don't see the human side, the vulnerability side of senior leaders very often. And that was, again, a special opportunity to be able to be part of that, I suppose. I also had two really other interesting visits that went on while I was there. One was by Prince William. And I remember vividly the British contingent commander coming and talking to me, who's a personal friend of mine anyway. And he said, could have a chat, and came in and said, we've got a visit coming in at a really odd hour of the morning that I just wanted to make you aware of and just see whether you wanted to be involved with it, because I know you like to be involved with these kind of visits. And he showed me the visit plan, and it was a senior RAF officer who was coming in as part of this visit. And would I be there for him? And the visit was basically arriving at about 11 o'clock at night and leaving at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I went, well, thanks, but on this occasion, I think I'll let you just handle it. And then he handed me the alternative piece of paper that was actually what the visit was all about, which was this senior RAF officer was the escort officer for Prince William, who had been on a visit out to the Middle East earlier in the day. He was then coming to us to have a look around the base and talk to as many people as he could in the period of time that he had, which was obviously a really funny hour of the day. And of course, I changed my mind about supporting the visit. I said, yeah, it would be an honor to meet him. I'd never met him up to that point. He'd very recently graduated from Royal Air Force Valley and got his pilot's wings. So I thought it was a great opportunity to meet him and congratulate him on that, and hopefully have a brief chance to showcase what we were doing on the base as well. And that's what happened. And it was one of the visits that I really remember the most, because he was so impressive as an individual, turning up at that hour of the day when he'd obviously been up a long time on a previous visit in Al Udeid out in the Middle East, and had then flown up to us and was still acutely conscious that he was going to be making a first impression with everyone he met, and that he wanted that first impression to be a positive one. And he was just outstanding at that. He was great at putting people at their ease. He clearly enjoyed the conversations, and I think it was a wonderful privilege for everyone that met him. And so that was lovely, and was one of the really special moments of the time there. I contrast that deliberately with another visit by another member of the royal family, who these days is kind of too hot to handle in many ways, but that's Prince Andrew. And Prince Andrew came to us flying himself in, actually, in a helicopter from Camp Bastion. He flew in the jump seat of a Chinook, and I think spent part of the time actually in the pilot seat of the Chinook, flying in, having been for a visit to Helmand Province, then coming to Kandahar to come and, again, mainly meet the British contingent. And it was nice that he came. No question, it was nice that he came. But at the same time, I got in a car with him when I met him on arrival to then take him off to his first visit element. And his opening gambit was to complain about the quality of air traffic control, because obviously he'd been flying in and therefore had been hearing and working with air traffic control on the way in. And he is a pilot. Obviously, he's a helicopter pilot. He flew in the Falklands War and has a lot of credibility in that space. But it's not often you have to turn around and kind of rebuke or disagree with a visitor of that standing and status, but I absolutely did on this occasion. And I took him to task. I said, no, sir, I'm afraid you're wrong. The reality is air traffic control here deals with the most difficult operating environment I've ever seen in my time in the Air Force. They have every different conceivable type of aeroplane. So from unmanned air vehicles through to the heaviest transports and everything in between operating simultaneously off this base in a very complex environment with threats, etc., that we have to deal with, and a lot of limitations in terms of kit and capability that you wouldn't normally find if you were operating on a well-found normal airfield. And so I took real issue with it, and he harumphed a little bit. And actually, by later in the day, he'd mellowed a bit, and he was. I was at dinner with him that night, and he was kind of a different character. But it really struck me that, again, you never get that second chance to make a first impression, and it was just one of those things. I think, as a visitor to something, and maybe a point for everyone to take away here, particularly those of you that are in leadership positions where you're going and visiting people and talking to part of your team maybe, or to others outside your team but in your orbit that you haven't met before, that this is such an important thing to think about, right? What preparation am I actually going to do for that visit? How am I going to make sure that I do land and make the best possible initial impression when I get there? Because it's lasting. It's really lasting. I mean, particularly for a senior visitor. I remember the royal family is obviously at an extreme end of that, but it definitely makes a big difference. And I think anybody would want to be making the best impression they could. And therefore, thinking about that a little bit and just giving yourself the chance to do your very best when you're in that space is a vitally important thing to do. And again, I contrast that another positive one that I thought was tremendous. I mentioned that Condoleezza Rice had come in with David Miliband, and obviously it was effectively the two foreign secretaries, if you like, the American Secretary of State and the UK Foreign Secretary, who were coming in together. They flew in a C-17 transport aircraft, and I met them and was part of the initial briefing that they received about what was going on in the Afghanistan theatre, etc. And that was, again, absolutely fascinating to see the way that those two senior political operators worked and spoke to people and engaged with them. And it was amazingly positive. I mean, Condoleezza Rice was an absolutely lovely individual. Fantastic to meet her. David Miliband, similar, really nice, very, very engaging, interesting as a person. And you wanted to spend more time with him. You absolutely wanted to be in the space where you felt that you could have a longer discussion rather than kind of wishing the visit was over and when could it move on, which had been the case with the Prince Andrew one, but also with one or two others that we had as well, which were similarly a little bit brusque and frosty and difficult. I didn't wish necessarily for even more senior visits some of the time. I have to say, having seen the security that came along with Condoleezza Rice and the challenges we had with the Secret Service and getting them to actually engage and work with my own force protection to ensure that we didn't have some kind of horrible conflict risk, that was a really big deal. And I thought, wow, if we'd had an even more senior American, so the vice president or the president, for example, I can only imagine what that would have actually involved. And that didn't happen. We didn't have either of those. So that was a good thing, because I think it would have been tremendously difficult had we done so. But visits were key because it gave us an opportunity to showcase what we did. And so thinking about the visit programs and making sure that we got the visitor around where we could to the maximum amount of places we could, where they saw the good, the bad, the challenging, the ugly of what it was actually like to be out there, was really, really important. And I think we achieved that on the majority of these visits. I think they came away with a very balanced impression. Generally, we wanted them to meet people and for the people to have a chance to meet them, because, again, that was a big boost to the morale of the troops on the base, particularly if they're meeting their own senior military commander or a senior political leader they potentially haven't met before. And having a chance not just to do some kind of brush by 2-minute conversation, but to have a more meaningful conversation was really valuable. And it takes me back to a long time prior to my time in Afghanistan, where I was out in Saudi Arabia. And I've talked about this on a previous podcast, where the then chief of joint operations, General Sir Christopher Wallace, came out and he spoke to me after the first visit and said, Bob, next time I come back, I need more time in all of these different events that we're doing on the visit to talk to people. And he took that time and really did have meaningful conversations. And I'd remembered that and taken that forward into the way we planned the visits we had in Afghanistan, because it did make a big difference. It wasn't about FaceTime for me or any of my senior team. It was firmly about making sure we had the chance to put across the messages we wanted to get across, but also to give them that time to actually go and talk to real troops on the ground, doing the kind of gritty end of the job, and have a really decent opportunity to have that two-way exchange. That was true whether it was a much smaller contingent with a tiny team in some instances, through to the very big deployments, big detachments that we had. So whether it was a senior American military visitor, or whether it was, in one case, I had a Slovakian minister, government minister, who came and visited my Slovakian demining detachment who were there on the base. And actually, we presented some medals to his team. And he was very proud to do that. And we'd offered him the opportunity to do it. And I don't think his team had originally thought about it that way. And actually, that worked really, really well. It was a great event. So those kind of things, I think, are really important to think about as to how you actually plan, if you have the opportunity to plan these kind of things, how you engage when you're on the visit itself. If you're the leader, don't sit there and hog all the limelight. Make sure you are getting the guys out to go and visit the visitors out to go and visit your people, and give them enough time to have that kind of really meaningful, sensible conversation. Meals are a good way to do that, obviously, if you're in a position where you can do stuff at mealtime. And because, again, that tends to be a good barrier breakdown. It's not a formal setting. And quite quickly, they'll get a real, really good, strong impression of exactly what's going on. That's kind of all I wanted to cover on this episode. I think I won't belabor it any further than that. I think you can take away a lot of things about the way people act on visits and the way you prepare for those visits. And they're not just something that you just have to tolerate. They're something that generally should be a real opportunity that you want to make the very best of and try very hard to make the very best of. So thinking about how you can do that and how you handle the visit, whether you are the visitor or whether you are actually doing the planning for the visit and hosting the visit, are both really, really important features that I would absolutely encourage you to put some time into. Because it goes back to what I said at the very beginning. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. And very often, visits will be a first impression for either the visitor or for the people that are being visited. And in either one of those cases, definitely thinking about how you can make that the best opportunity you can and what you're going to take away from it is a really, really valuable exercise. I hope that's been useful. Again, a little vignette from my time in Afghanistan, more to come on some of the things that went on there on different episodes. But I'll be back with you very soon. Thanks very much, as ever, for listening. Really appreciate that. I really hope you've enjoyed this short podcast that covered another aspect of time in Afghanistan that was a really interesting one for me with visits. There were lots of them and a vast variety and some very different challenges that came up from those visits. And if you did enjoy it, then please like it, please share it, please comment on it, please give me some feedback, do all those kind of things. That would be really, really great. If you find this stuff valuable and I'm actually really helping you think about the way you're leading your own people or trying to influence your own leaders in other ways, then do think, please, about offering me some return value by supporting the podcast directly. You'll find the support the show link in your podcast platform, or you can go directly to my Patreon site and go to www.patreon.com/leadingforlife. And you'll have the opportunity there to financially support the podcast by either becoming a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. Doesn't cost very much, but it makes a very, very big difference to what we do, and I would hugely appreciate that if you're prepared to give that some thought and potentially be a direct supporter of what the show's all about. Thanks ever so much anyway. Really appreciate you listening, and all the very best. See you next time. Bye now.